So much of my research and teaching then is about how science is used in environmental affairs. A key aspect of this is basically understanding how to use science effectively when we're making decisions and formulating policies. And in other words, how to link knowledge and action, how to connect what we know with what we actually do. And this has obviously been a theme that's been running through all the interventions so far in terms of, especially there's been a dominant discourse here, I think, of failure to act on what we know, as Raoul outlined, about the state of the world's climate, to act effectively, whether as individuals or as organizations or as a society, to respond to the emerging climate challenge and crisis. So my first point, and I want to make 4 points in all, my first point obviously is that climate change is perhaps the leading example of failure to effectively connect science with policy, to connect knowledge with action. So there is ample scientific evidence, as Raoul has outlined, that we are changing our climate, and our grandchildren's climate is going to be much different than the current climate, and we are failing to respond to that reality. And instead, we can say that by and large, the climate science, the scientific knowledge about the climate, has been largely ineffective, that it's been either ignored or it's been used as a political football. And there's a lot of reasons for this ineffective science, I think. Partly it's a matter of economic interests, such as the oil and other industries, working together with various political agencies, such as our own federal government, to try to prevent or delay action. I think simple ignorance, a failure to communicate, is also important. It's also important, I think, as Laura has outlined, that there are various ways in which we think, which are contrary to thinking of the long term and making rational steps towards creating a sustainable future. So that's my first point, is just to outline how, just to note that climate change, climate science and climate policy is a story of failure. There's a sunny message. But my second point is that this failure to take effective action on climate science can be essentially traced back, I think, to how climate change itself has been so often defined as essentially a scientific problem. That we can see this, for example, the leading international forum for talking about climate change is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is predominantly a scientific agency. On the one hand, this might be seen as simply as logical as defining climate as a scientific issue, because if it wasn't for climate science, we would have perhaps random conversations about how what strange weather we're having, or the sea level seems to be creeping up around the world's coastlines, but we wouldn't be putting it together into some sort of knowledge about how we are actually changing the climate on the global scale. And it's interesting to note that all parties involved in the climate debate, in climate debates, have tended to accept this definition of climate as a scientific issue. Scientists themselves, environmentalists, and above all, those who oppose action on climate change, including the fossil fuel industry and the Canadian government, have been most active in insisting that climate is a scientific issue. And it's worth keeping that fact in mind. And that leads to my third point, that the key result of defining climate as a scientific issue has been paralysis. That there's been endless debates about the science, about what the latest scientific data indicate, what models tell us about the future state of the climate, what the role of humans is, and especially about whether the science is certain enough to compel action. A recent example has been the debate just over the last couple of weeks about how important is the contribution of the tar sands to Canada's contribution to global climate change. On the one hand, a couple of scientists argued in Nature, in the journal Nature, that tar sands are perhaps less important as a contributor to climate change than was once thought. Other scientists responded and said that this is entirely wrong-headed, that in fact controlling tar sands emissions are a central part of doing something about climate change itself. But the debate itself was just the most recent example of how, by framing the issue as a scientific one, you take the issue out of the realm of politics and talk about it as a scientific question that needs to be solved before action starts. And the biggest reason why scientific debates will tend to be essentially endless, as they have been over the last 30 or 40 years, is because scientific debates about climate change fail to deal effectively with what the actual issues are when we're talking about climate. When we talk about climate science, it sounds like we're talking about science, but we're actually talking about many other things, and especially about what people see as the consequences of the science, and what people see as the consequences of accepting that the science of climate is in fact true. So this is my fourth point, my final point, fortunately, if we want to move beyond paralysis and take action on climate, then we have to resist defining climate as a scientific issue. It's not. It's a political and a moral issue with scientific content, and that's a very different thing. As a political and moral issue, climate change is a problem of collective action, of figuring out how to think about the future, how to share costs and benefits in a wildly unequal world in political and economic terms, how to foster trust and genuine collaboration, not least between our generation and future generations, and how to empower people to take action, whether individually or collectively. And these aren't challenges that can be solved in the laboratory or using a computer model. There are many ways in which real action can be taken right now, and we can talk about policy options, of which there are a great number of them that are available. But the notion that we need to wait until we get the science absolutely right, that is, until we really understand carbon and climate change, is itself the biggest obstacle to making progress.